In the Haggadah we just finished, we are reminded to teach our children about our history. As it says, on this day you shall teach your children. No parent could have embodied this commandment like my mother, Trudy. With a quiet dignity and grace, my mother set about to make sure that her children, and thousands of children everywhere, would know what the Nazis did to her and her family when she was only 11 years old. She and her parents were deported to Auschwitz in 1944, and that is the last place she ever saw her father. These experiences affected her in ways I can only imagine. I say this because throughout my and my brother Danny's childhood, our home was a home not of painful memory, but a home of love and kindness. The scars and anger she could have carried, she instead turned into a passion and commitment to show her family what a beautiful life of Yiddishkeit was supposed to be like. The life that was stolen away from her, she made sure to provide for us. As we grew old enough to understand, she told us about what happened. She knew she had a sacred obligation to make sure this history is never forgotten. She, together with our father Saul Englander, a survivor of Hungarian labor camps, who chaired the Yom HaShoah program in Kew Garden Hills for many years, imbued within us the commitment to make sure that the world would never forget the 6 million. My mother has spoken on many occasions to children and adults alike. Her video testimony from the Shoah Foundation was used by Steven Spielberg in his televised documentary. I call upon tonight's keynote speaker, my mother, my role model, Trudy.
Honored Rabbi, Sheri Dana, Sheri Daniel, my precious family, our friends, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My claim to fame is that I was in Auschwitz as a very young child. But the Holocaust did not start with Auschwitz. I was born in Bratislava. Today is the capital of Slovakia. At that time it was Czechoslovakia. Jews lived in Czechoslovakia. There was no outward anti-Semitism. They participated in all walks of life. They were law-abiding, tax-paying citizens. I am the daughter of middle-class parents. My father, Sholom, was a businessman. My mom, may she rest in peace, was a homemaker. I had grandparents, I had 2 great-grandmothers, I had uncles, I had aunts, I had cousins. We had an extended family, a big family, wonderful relationships with family and friends. There really should have been no cloud in my sky. And yet, one of the earliest memories that I have, I wasn't even 4 years old at the time, was being taken to the Danube on an afternoon. I sit by our housekeeper, and I played there. There was a park on the banks of the Danube, and I played there with other children. And a woman approaches me, and my mother tongue is German, and she says to me in German, "Wait till Uncle Dolphy comes. He will kill you all." I looked at her. I really didn't understand. I had no such uncle. I came home and I asked my parents, and my mom said, "Oh, forget about it, the lady doesn't know what she's talking about." But there passed a look between my parents, and I understood that I'm not being told everything, that evil is lurking. But then life returned to normal for a while. The following year, Hitler annexed our neighbor Austria, and the acting Germans and the anti-Semites became emboldened, and they raised their ugly head. Signs appeared, Jews are not welcome. But still, there was not really anything there. But then, in 1939, Slovakia became independent, headed by a Catholic priest, and within a very, very short time, Jewish laws were enacted and strictly and forcefully enforced. They started out, Jews are not supposed to employ Gentiles. Jews are not supposed to have a radio, they confiscated ours. Jews are not supposed to be on the street early in the morning unless you had a work permit or you went to school. Jews are not supposed to be out after a certain hour at night. Jews are not supposed to have musical instruments. Jews are not supposed to have pets. Jews are not supposed to live in a certain area. One day a woman walked into our apartment. She really just rang the bell, walked in, nodded her head. Yes, she liked it. 2 weeks later we were out of there, kicked out. A man walked into my father's business and said, "Good morning, gentlemen. I am the new owner and you are my employees." This was called an arizator. He made the business Aryan, no longer Jewish. And yet we were lucky because he kept my father and his partners, because after all he had no idea what the business was about. There were very many indignities and forced humiliations. Jewish men were forced to sweep the street or sometimes clean it with a toothbrush. But then the Jewish star came out. And now we were targets because they could identify us. We did not look any different than the rest of the population, but now you could see us from far away. Sometimes Jewish men were beaten up on the street, they were accosted, and there was really nothing that you could do about it. You couldn't go to the police because they would not do anything either. I was walking, I was running once to catch up with my parents, and that was a time I had no coat on. And by the way, if you had 3 layers of clothes, you had the Jewish star attached to all 3 layers. But there were 2 German girls, they might have been my age, maybe a little bit older, walking on the other side of the street. One says to the other, "Look, a Jewess, and a Jude." They crossed the street, they obstructed my way, and they spit at me. And there was nothing I could do, I just had to stand there, accept it till they finished. And of course, it had been drilled into me, God forbid, do not defend yourself. So we lived like that, accepted it, but we are a strong people. We bend like the proverbial stalk of wheat. We bent low, but we did not pray. We could live with all of that. We could not live with deportation. In between, the Jewish school buildings had been confiscated, the Jewish hospital had been confiscated. All of this was, quote, acceptable, unquote. But in 1942, the transport started what we thought to the east. Later on, we found out it meant to Auschwitz. My mother's parents, my father's brothers, friends, cousins, they disappeared. I remember going to school, and by that time we had no longer a school building, we were in an apartment in various rooms. And girls that had been there the day before were no longer there because there had been action at night. And this went on for all of 1942, and then the transport stopped. And we were hoping and praying, maybe we will survive somehow this deprivation, this humiliation, but we could make it. But in 1944, there was an unsuccessful uprising in Slovakia, and Germany officially occupied Slovakia. And it was the end of August, and 4 weeks later, they literally swept the country clean of Jews. It was the day after Yom Kippur, and I woke up at night with my mother in my bed, holding a hand to my mouth and whispering onto my ear, "Trudy, do not make a sound, do not move." And that's when I realized that somebody is ringing the bell and banging on our door. The year before, my parents had paid a Gentile gentleman for the privilege of putting his name on our door, so we were somehow hoping maybe they are not coming in. But of course that was in vain. A minute later the door broke, there was a light going on, and a whole bunch of Germans came, I don't know, trampling into our house. One went straight to my father, he beat him up. The other one came to my mom and said, "Why didn't you open the door?" And my mother said, "We slept very deeply." And of course the typical proverbial, raus, schnell, out, fast. They told us to get dressed, in shock. My parents got dressed. Eventually they got me to move and to get dressed too. I was handed a little backpack which my parents had prepared for all of us just in case. And we were marched out of our apartment into a waiting truck. There were some other Jewish families there. We were taken to the city, left off at the gathering point, and then there were people from all over who came to that point, and we were marched to one of the probably cargo train stations. I don't know how long we were lolling and standing there. Eventually there were boxes that looked like anybody has seen cattle cars. These are like closed wooden boxes. So we were made to board those cars. And then the doors closed on us. We were maybe 80 people in that boxcar. There were two small windows, one on one side, one on the other, practically no air, children crying. It was a misery. We were taken to a place called Seret, which should have been a 2-hour train drive. We arrived pre-dawn the next day. Seret had been previously a labor camp. We were told to stay there, told where to go. We arrived Saturday morning, pre-dawn. We were in Seret till Monday morning, pre-dawn. And then marched out again, and there were the tracks very close to that camp, and again the cattle cars. This time we were probably a little bit more frightened, more nervous. People were sick, people were more nervous. And we boarded 75 to 80 people into a car. We were fortunate because we sat next to the wall. We had some place to lean on. But there were people who were pushed into the middle, and they had no place to lean on and no place to sit down. And somebody was saying, could you please move your legs because I have no room to sit down. But there was no place to move. Children were crying, people were sick. We had a lady in the car who wasn't all there, she was yelling. It just was indescribable. On top of all, we were given 2 buckets for human needs. And then that terrible, terrible feeling when you hear the door closing, the scraping, and you know you're being locked in, and then metal against metal, you're locked. Eventually the train started. I cannot describe the atmosphere. I had never heard the word Auschwitz, and I certainly had never heard the word or the concept extermination camp. But as the train progressed, somehow a man made his way close to where we were sitting, and he looked out at the window and he saw the name of the stations. And he said, I think we are going to Auschwitz, we are heading into Silesia. I think this was the first time I heard that word, but my parents must have heard it because I saw a look passing. We eventually arrived Tuesday night. We were like 2 days and a night en route. And again, we were riding. I was secure. I was sitting with my parents as much as I could call myself secure. But then the train stopped, and you know you arrived. I do not know where we arrived, but we arrived. And within a very short time, we heard screaming and yelling. First, you didn't understand what it was. You heard all the dogs barking. But as we were not the first car, not the last one, so we started hearing doors open and metal against metal scraping. And as the sounds came closer, my father, Sholom, said, Trudy, get up. He wanted to bench me. He did. And then they opened our car. And there were prisoners who had been there probably for a year or two in Auschwitz. They wore the striped guard. Cattle cars are high, there are no steps, there are no ramps, so they helped us jump off. And I said very politely to this gentleman, thank you very much. Next we helped my mother jump off, and he told her something. And I know the man took his life in his hand, but he probably died. He asked my mother, how old is she? And my mother said 11. And he said, 18, or I kill you. And he disappeared. But once we were down on the ground, and I cannot describe you the platform, the arrival, the barbed wire fence, the strong lights, the smell in the air, dogs barking, Germans walking with sticks. Once we were all down, they yelled, "Männer nach rechts," men to the right. And that was the last time I saw my father. We were a column of women. We started moving forward. And again, I do not know how long it took, but eventually we came to a little platform, and there were a whole bunch of German officers. One had like a baton in his hand, and he was going like that. I did not know at the time, but this was my first selection. I felt myself flying to the right. I looked back. Thank God. 3 seconds later, my mother came flying. By the time they finished the selection, there weren't that many of us left. Because any lady who carried a child, or who held the hand of a child, or who looked not very fit, and who among us looked very fit after this 48 hours en route, or somebody who was supporting an older person, or if it was an older person, they never made it to the right. Eventually, those of us that made it, or we thought we made it, were marched to a large building, and again the rules: undress, and please remember where you put your clothes. So we undressed, and there were some women sitting near chairs, and they shaved our heads. And while we were standing there, my parents had some very, very, very close friends. And the woman was pregnant. And my mother and I were standing very close to her. And in comes this German officer. At the time I did not know who he was. And he goes over to this lady, Aleha Sholom, and he asked her, "Are you pregnant?" And she said no. He was a doctor. He touched her, and he said, "Take your shoes and your coat." And at that second I understood. I will never see her again. But that woman looked at us. We were her friends, and she stood very close to us. And there was something in her eyes which was fear, hopelessness, resignation, and she blinked goodbye. I can never forget it. Her eyes haunt me till today, and I think of her frequently. Nobody ever saw her again. And at that time I did not know that an hour later she would be going up in smoke. But then a door opened, and we were pushed into another room. There must have been 60 or 80 shower heads. They opened hot water. I don't know how long we were in there. Then another door opened. We were pushed out, shoved out. Everything was schnell raus, the proverbial fast, out. They were each handed a rag, which must have been at one time a garment. I was a little girl. I got something with holes, which must have been probably 6 or 8 sizes too big for me, plus a pair of wooden clogs. We all got wooden clogs. When everybody was issued their new outfit, we were pushed out through another door. It was cold, it was dreary, it's Poland in early October, and we were marched to the barracks. I don't want to tell you about the inside of the barracks, or how we got there, because I'm sure you have all seen pictures of this beautiful 5-star hotel. But I have to tell you about the atmosphere. You could smell misery. There must have been some women in there who had been there some time before us. The most terrible thing was we were afraid for ourselves, but we were more afraid of the unknown. Where are our men? What happened to them? My father, somebody's husband, somebody's child, somebody's brother, somebody's father. We had no knowledge, and there was no way of finding out anything. besides the hunger and the deprivation and the misery and the physical, for me the worst part was the zelaktion, the being counted. And we were shoved out of the barracks at least twice a day. We had to stand in rows of 5, the tallest in the back, the shortest in the front. You had to stand without moving. God forbid, if you itched and you scratched your nose, you were either hit or worse, dragged away, never to be seen again. We stood mostly 2 hours till we were counted, if we were lucky. Sometimes we were standing 3 hours. If somebody passed out, the lady just was like a heap on the floor. Nobody was allowed to help her. And then again, there were people who died in the middle of the night or who passed out. And these people had to be dragged out, because after all, the numbers had to add up. They had to be counted. And so we had to stand there twice a day. Sometimes it was raining, sometimes it was cold. We were lucky it was 2 hours. If not, we stood 3. I'm not going to tell you about the dogs barking, about people being hit, about people being slapped. This is nothing. The fear was always, what's happening? We were fortunate. We were in Auschwitz for 10 days because we were still quote-unquote strong. We had just come. We were marched to the train, and there were tracks close by, and we were issued enlistment clothing. Some underwear, stockings, a dress, a coat, and even shoes. I'm not going to say we were equipped for the cold, but these were garments, we were dressed. And before we boarded the train, there was somebody with a clipboard, a German, and some of the Jewish girls who had been in Auschwitz since 1942. They took our name and they took our age. And I was registered as 18. We boarded the train. I have no idea how long we went, but we went into Germany proper, into Saxony, a town called Freiburg, into an airplane factory. I do not remember too much of our arrival. But I remember being assigned our workplace. My mom and I, we were assigned to a place called Filerei, which means filing. But it doesn't mean to file papers. It means we were standing by a metal vise and filing metal pieces that had some forms outlined on them into shape. And we were standing there from 6 in the morning, 14 hours a day, till 8 at night. In between, there were the additional 10 hours. We were marched down, we were counted, we were given quote-unquote food, whatever was considered food. We had to clean our rooms, we had to clean out the access, we had to clean this, that. We might have slept maybe 5 hours a night, very little food, very little rest. And this must have gone on for maybe 4 weeks, maybe. And I started showing that I'm just a child, I cannot take it. I do not remember exactly what it was, but once I almost passed out, I was crying, I couldn't move, I couldn't stand, I couldn't. So my mom asked around her friends, and on advice, and she took advice, she said, Heidi, you have to tell them that Trudy is only 11 years old. So this is what my mother did. And the next day, when I came to work, there was a very nice Polish lady, a Jewish lady. She heard I'm 11, I do not know where from, but she got a chair, and now I was sitting and filing away. Within a very, very short time, the Scharführer, who was in charge of our camp, there were 1,000 women, marched over to our table, looks at me and says, and again, my mother tongue is German, I could talk to him. He says, what are you doing here? Are you playing? I said, no, I'm working. You're working? Yes. He looks at my mother, looks at me, says, out with me. So he marched us out, closed the door of this huge hall, and we were in this little corridor. And he had sheets of paper in front of him, our names and our ages. I asked my name, and he says, it says here she's 18. You are telling me she's 11. Why did you do that? He asked my mother. And my mother, may she rest in peace, was a very smart lady, and she spoke a beautiful German. And she looks at the man, and she says, "Look at my daughter. She's tall, she's strong, she can work." I didn't want it should look like she's shirking her duty. And he says to my mother, "But if you would have told the truth, she wouldn't have had to work so hard. She would have stayed in Auschwitz." And my mother knelt down and put her hands together and said, "Please, please, I'm willing to work twice as hard, and I'll eat half as much. Please, do not take her away from me. She's not lazy." And he said, "All right, get up." And he says, "Was Auschwitz so terrible?" And my mother couldn't talk anymore. So he says, "Go back to work." We knew that something was going to happen. After all, you couldn't leave an 11-year-old child. But my mom had no choice. About an hour or two later, we were marched down to get our lunchtime meal. And then again, we were all standing, the whistle blew, and we were all standing in the rows of 5, a column of a few hundred women. And in comes the German, and he says, "Everybody off to work except the 11-year-old. We were sure he's going to kill me, because after all, what is he going to do with a child? As many women as there were, they were crying. So was I. I really did not want to die. But looking back today as a parent, I cannot imagine what my mother must have felt when she kissed me and hugged me goodbye. You let your child go, you know that she's going to be killed, and there is nothing that you can do to help, to prevent, to make it easier. They all marched off to work, and I was standing there waiting, I don't know for what. He comes over to me, he says, "From now on you have to work only 9 hours, now go." So that, I'm here now. And that made my life easier, my mother's life easier, but everybody else's in our camp, because we knew that there is no imminent danger of being shot. We stayed in Freiburg, and I don't think under wonderful conditions, but we were not afraid of being killed. To the middle of April, by that time you could hear the artillery of the Russian front coming closer. And so we were marched back to the railroad, but this time we were put into coal cars. Coal cars are open, they have no roof. We didn't know where we were going. We were not issued food, but we were going. We were taken to Mauthausen, which was a horror concentration camp in Austria. We were 2 weeks en route. We did not get food, maybe every second day, something. It was Germany, it was the middle of April, and we are in those open cars, and it was raining day and night for about 8 days, non-stop. Eventually we arrived in Mauthausen, but by that time you could feel that it's not such a strong discipline anymore. We are marching to camp, we were shoved into a barrack, no straw, no blanket in our probably wet clothes, and my mother was already in bad shape. But we were allowed to step outside of the barracks. And so my mother used to say, "Trudy, go out and take a look." I am not callous. I am not devoid of feeling. But out I went, and my foot hit something, and it was a human head. So I stepped around it, and I went a few steps further, and there was another dead body. But I had seen so much death and so much misery that it did not mean much anymore. We were 1 week in Mauthausen, and then on the 5th of May, there was noise outside, but not crying or screeching or fear, but noise. So my mother says, "Trudy, go out." And I went out, and somebody said, "We have been liberated. God bless the United States Army. They liberated us on May 5th, 1945. Wonderful. We were free. We were liberated. But to tell you that everything was wonderful, no, it was not. Many, many, many of the people in the camps died after the liberation. People were hurt, people were scarred, people were sick. And everybody tried to get home. So did my mother and I, with the vain hope that we are going to find our family. Well, we came home. My father didn't survive, his brothers didn't survive, my mother's parents, my mother's brother, my grandparents, uncles, aunts. There were very, very few of us, and the horror was indescribable. We were not even welcomed by the general population, because not that we expected it, but it just was a little bit added misery. But as I said in the beginning, as an individual, we might be weak. As a people, we are very strong. We survived. We rebuilt our lives. My mother remarried, and I was blessed with a sister. Baruch Hashem, I have a wonderful family.